The words to which I should like to call your attention this evening are to be found in Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians in chapter 3, reading verses 18, 19, and 20. Verses 18, 19, and 20 in the third chapter of Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians. Let no man deceive himself. If any man among you seemeth to be wise in this world, let him become a fool, that he may be wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. For it is written, He taketh the wise in their own craftiness. And again, the Lord knoweth the thoughts of the wise, that they are vain. And then he goes on to say, therefore let no man glory in men. Now, those who were here last Sunday night will recall that we were considering the statement recorded in the 11th verse of that chapter, where the apostle says, other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ. And then he goes on to say, now if any man build upon this foundation gold or silver or precious stones, wood, hay, stubble, every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire. And the fire shall try every man's work, of what sort it is. If any man's work abide which he hath built thereupon, he shall receive a reward. If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss. But he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy. For the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are. Then comes the word that we are considering tonight. Let no man deceive himself. If any man among you seemeth to be, or thinks that he is, wise in this world and in the sense of this world's wisdom, let him become a fool. Let him become what the world regards as a fool, that he may be made really wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. And he then proves that from two Old Testament quotations, and ends by saying, therefore let no man glory in men. Now there is nothing, it sometimes seems to me, about the modern man which is quite so foolish as the way in which he seems to think that the conditions in which he finds himself are entirely different from the conditions and the position confronting all mankind hitherto. This is very characteristic of the modern man, that he believes his problems are new problems. Now, there is nothing, I say, that is quite so foolish about the modern anti-Christian point of view as just that. And there is a very simple way in which one can demonstrate that, and that is to say this. If we had no other proof of the fact that man doesn't change essentially, we've got it in this, that man still goes on repeating the same old mistakes as have been committed by men throughout the centuries. If you like that in a more philosophical form, you've got it in that adage of Hegel. We learn from history that we learn nothing from history. We go on repeating the same old mistakes. If that is true, more or less in general with respect to man and his conduct in this world, it is particularly true in the matter of his attitude towards this gospel. Now, the modern idea is, so many believe this, that they reject this gospel because of these new conditions in which they find themselves. They talk about the changed world in which we live, atomic age, scientific age, that everything is different, that man now has grown up, he has a different view with all the knowledge that he's got, that the whole situation is quite different, that whereas this old gospel may have been all right 100 years ago and 1,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago nearly, it's obviously monstrous and ridiculous to present it, the same gospel, to the modern men because of these changes that have taken place and because of this entirely new position in which he finds himself. Now, I'm saying that there is nothing which is really quite so foolish and so ridiculous as just that attitude. And I can prove that to you very simply. If we'd got nothing but this first epistle to the Corinthians and even these first chapters, we would be able to give the lie direct to this idea that modern man has about himself. He will persist in thinking that there's something ultra-modern in rejecting this gospel. Well, now, the answer, of course, is simply this, that there is nothing new about this at all. The gospel of Jesus Christ was rejected in the first century, at the very beginning. Our Lord himself was not only rejected, he was vilified, he was crucified. And these apostles, as they went round preaching, they were given the same treatment. They met bitter opposition. The apostle Paul himself had to meet it constantly. He was referred to in the great intellectual city of Athens, the Mecca of the philosophers, as this babbler. And here he reminds us that this gospel was something that was being rejected in his own day and generation. There's nothing new about the fact, then, of the rejection of the gospel. But I want to go further. Mankind is not only not doing anything new in rejecting the gospel, we see further that his reasons for rejecting the gospel are not new either. He simply goes on repeating the same things as have been said by men throughout the running centuries, and were said even here away back, right at the very beginning. Now, there are many reasons which men give for their rejection of the Christian gospel. But one of the commonest, and today especially, I suppose it is the commonest of all. It is rejected, I say, in terms of human wisdom, human knowledge, human understanding. And yet, here in this very section with which we are dealing, the apostle shows that that was the very essence of the rejection of the gospel by the Greeks in the first century, in Paul's own day and generation. That was the reason why they, the Greeks speaking generally, the philosophers particularly, rejected this gospel, regarded it as foolishness, and condemned it utterly and outright. Now, you see, therefore, there is nothing new about this at all. Indeed, this was so much the case in Corinth that the apostle devotes the first four chapters of this great epistle to deal with this very theme. And here it is dealt with once and forever. And yet the astounding thing is that people go on uttering these cliches, making these foolish claims, giving these ridiculous reasons for their rejection of the gospel, as if they were doing something which is absolutely new. It isn't. The Greeks, on the whole, rejected the gospel for this one reason, that it seemed to their natural human wisdom, which we call philosophy, it appeared to be utterly ridiculous, foolishness, folly, something that was really quite unworthy of their consideration. Now, this is obviously, therefore, a very serious matter. Now, we are concerned here not about details. The difficulty about the Greek rejection of the gospel was not that it dissented from particular details or points. It was entirely opposed to it. The whole thing was to them sheer folly. And it is because this is still true that I'm calling your attention to this whole matter. The difficulty today that people have with the gospel, as it is in the New Testament, that they reject it in total, the whole thing. And there are some who are even foolish enough to be trying to construct what they call a new gospel, a gospel that suits modern men in this atomic age. And here they are trying to construct a gospel that will be acceptable to the modern man, of whom they're so fond of telling us that he no longer believes in a three-dimensional world and so on, and cannot possibly believe in the supernatural and the miraculous and things of that kind. Now, that, according to the apostle, is not only a complete travesty of the gospel, it is a betrayal of the gospel. He wrote these 4 chapters specifically to deal with that very point. That was the thing that was happening in Corinth. There were these other teachers who were coming in and trying to introduce an admixture of philosophy, and Paul says, you mustn't do this. And that is why, as we saw last Sunday night, he says, other foundation can no man lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. And he goes on to say, not only that, be very careful what you erect on this foundation. It must be consistent with and in accordance with the character of the foundation. He says, you add certain things, you destroy the whole. As he put it there in the 17th verse of the 1st chapter. If you add this human wisdom, you make the cross of Christ of none effect. And yet, my dear friends, isn't that the very thing that is happening at the present time? Isn't this the tragedy that so often this very thing that Paul condemns is the thing that is being presented and advocated as the gospel, the Christianity for the modern man? It is a complete denial of the essence of Paul's teaching in these great chapters. Now then, this is so vital that I'm calling your attention to it. What can be more important? If our whole approach to the gospel is wrong, well then we become wrong eventually at every point. You can't select certain things. This is a whole. As Paul says, there is this intimate connection between foundation and superstructure. It is all one piece. It must all fit together. It's all going to be tried. If you begin to try to build on this foundation wood or hay or stubble, when the trial comes, and it's a trial by fire, there'll be nothing left of your wood and hay and stubble. There is only one kind of material that is appropriate to such a foundation, and that is gold, silver, precious stones. Something that can stand the test of fire and purification and come through. So, you see, this is a really vital matter. Let me, therefore, put it to your consideration this evening in the form of some 3 principles. Here's the first. The gospel of Jesus Christ is a complete contrast to everything else that man thinks and has been taught. Now, there it is. I put it as a principle. The gospel of Jesus Christ is a complete contrast to everything we think by nature, everything that human wisdom and knowledge can bring to us. Now, I'm emphasizing this. The gospel does not merely differ slightly in certain details. It's altogether different. And the altogether aspect is much more important than the details. You see, this is where so many have gone wrong. Books used to be written about this a great deal during the end of the last century. People used to point out how much of the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount could be found in Seneca and so on, and in various other Greek philosophers. And of course that's perfectly true. What's the difference then? You see, the mistake there is to take certain details of the teaching and say, well, you get parallels, you get things similar in Greek philosophy and teaching. Therefore, after all, the gospel isn't very much different. That was their whole attempt. They were trying to reconstruct Jesus, the human Jesus, the Jesus of history, and to reduce the teaching of the gospel to the level of a glorified morality teaching and humanism. But you see where they were wrong. The vital point is not the details. It is the whole thing. And here I am emphasizing that the gospel isn't merely different slightly here and there and in particular respects from other teachings. It is altogether different. It is entirely different. It is unique. Let me put that in a second way. The gospel, therefore, is not one of a series of teachings. We can't say this too often because the opposite is being said too often. Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Jesus, and so on. Now, the gospel is not one of a series. It is unique. It is entirely on its own. This is the whole point that is made by the apostle. He contrasts the wisdom of God and the wisdom of this world. And he says that they're entirely different. Now, in what respects are they different? Well, I want to show you this, first of all, in general, before we come to the particulars. These are the very contrasts which are made by the apostle. All other teachings confronting the human race tonight, at their best and at their highest, are all of men. It's no part of the preaching of the gospel, in a sense, to disparage the efforts of men, only when they claim to be adequate and claim to be gospel. But the point about them all is, even at their best and their highest, that they're entirely and altogether of man. Take the most exalted teachings. It is a men or a group of men that have produced them and propounded them and propagated them. Always of men. But here we have something entirely different. This is altogether of God. That is why I say you must never put it into series with anything else. It's different. That's why the Christian faith is different from the so-called world religions. It doesn't belong to them. They've all been conjured up and produced by men, great thinkers, all right, but they're men. It's men trying to find God. Here it's the exact opposite. It is God seeking men in his lost and terrible condition. Or to put that in a slightly different form, all other teachings are the results of men's ability, men's reason, men's thinking, men's searching, men's research, if you like. This is the great word of today, research. Investigation, endeavor, searching, delving into the mystery, using your abilities and your powers. And we know that all knowledge that belongs to men has been discovered in that way. There was a time when men used to just sit down. That was the philosophical method. You sat down and you thought about life and you evolved your theories. And then you tried them by experiments and by practice. Well, now, that still goes on, but less and less has it been a matter of abstract thought, and more has it been a question of experimentation. And this is the great age of research. And we are proud of our knowledge, the knowledge we've garnered and the information we have, and the advances that have been made. Now, it doesn't matter what realm you're thinking of at all. Human knowledge and human wisdom all comes as the result of men seeking and searching and endeavor. This is entirely and absolutely and altogether different. How? Well, in this way, that this is entirely a matter of revelation. Now, this is basic, as you can see, and quite fundamental. That is why I say it is altogether different from everything that is known to men. This is God making things known. Not men arriving at the knowledge, but God making the knowledge plain and clear and manifest. Now, it's not surprising that this Apostle Paul of all men should be emphasizing this particular point, because here was an unusually able and brilliant man, one of the great minds, one of the great brains of the ages, brilliant scholar. Not only in his own particular realm, he was outstanding as a Pharisee, unusually well trained, particularly erudite. But he had his knowledge of Greek philosophy also. He was a Roman citizen by birth. He was a very cultured man. And you remember how he tells us in his autobiography in Philippians 3 that he had trusted to this, and he had done well in it, and he had excelled at it, and he was tremendously proud of himself. And then suddenly it was all shattered. Shattered by what? Shattered by what he saw. Shattered by what he was given to see. He was on his way to Damascus, you remember, breathing out threatenings and slaughter, intent upon the destruction of the Christian church. He did it in all good conscience, he says. He thought he was rendering God service. It was in accord with all his learning and his law and his studying and all his brilliant understanding and logic. But suddenly, something happens to him. A light shines in the heavens. The face appears. The voice speaks. And he's completely shattered. He's changed right about. And he now becomes a preacher and an apostle of the Christian message. How did he ever come to that? Was it as the result of his thinking and his reading and his meditation and his listening to lectures and discussions? Of course it wasn't. It was the opposite of that. It was God revealing it unto him. And that's the great point which he makes in these 4 great chapters. God, he says in chapter 2, hath revealed them unto us by his Spirit. For the Spirit searcheth all things, yea, the deep things of God. This is revelation. And it's the eternal opposite of everything that human wisdom depends upon. It's altogether different, you see, even in its method. And another way in which I can show you one of these general differences is this. Take human knowledge in any realm, philosophy, science, any other study you like. Its great characteristic is that it changes, that it grows, that it develops with the passage of time. Needn't waste your time with this. I've often pointed it out to you. Take a textbook on medicine. They're always having to bring out new editions, and there are great changes. A textbook of 40 years ago, the kind of textbook I had to read, right out of date. It's no use reading that now. Knowledge advances, knowledge grows and develops, and it's the same in all these other realms. Constant change, development, and so on. That's the characteristic of all human wisdom, in a sense, isn't it? I know we can make too much even of that point. I wonder how much further we've got as regards pure thought and understanding beyond the Greek philosophers. But we think we have. We certainly know facts and certain details of knowledge of which they were ignorant. This is the characteristic of man's wisdom, which he arrives at as the result of his own efforts and research. But when you come to this, my friend, it's altogether different. The great characteristic of this is that it's changeless, that it is eternal. It is called the everlasting gospel. Jude talks about the faith once and forever delivered to the saints. Now this, you see, is an absolute point. All other knowledge in all other realms, I say, go in for the latest. Get the latest textbook. Generally the latest is the best. But when you come here, there is no change. There is no development. There is no difference. It is the changeless, everlasting gospel. We are face to face with truth, unchanged, unchanging. I'll go further. This cannot even be modified. And that was, as I say, the particular point that the apostle was making with respect to the church at Corinth. They were saying, all right, we agree about the foundation, but you don't stop there. They were adding to it, trying to introduce a bit of philosophy. Don't, says Paul, don't. You're modifying it. You can't modify this gospel. Because it is of God, it is eternal, it is changeless. It doesn't change with the passing of the centuries. So that there is no greater denial of this gospel than to say that because we are in the 20th century that we need a new gospel. That's to go back to man and to philosophy, to human wisdom. It is the exact opposite of this. This is God's, and it's once and forever. And lastly, on this general point, the great characteristic, of course, of human wisdom and of human learning is that it gives glory to man. So Paul ends off by saying here, therefore, let no man glory in men. You see what they were doing at Corinth, behaving like children, he says. One says, I'm of Paul. Says, no, says the other, Apollos is better. No, wait a minute, so the Cephas is the man, you know. And here they were, dividing up Christ and the church into factions, into rival groups, in terms of men. I said at the beginning that the world doesn't change. And it doesn't. The modern world is doing exactly the same thing. I was thinking to myself as I was preparing this meditation of the fashions that I have seen coming and going in the realm of religion during my lifetime, during my period in the ministry. You know, there were certain names 40 years ago you never hear them mentioned, or the modern man probably has never heard of them at all. Certain name, this is it, this is the man. And everybody runs after him, they all buy his books. Quite forgotten by now, another one comes up, this is the man. And so they do it, you see. These fashions come and go. Karl Barth came along, it was all Karl Barth, but he's on the wane now. Bultmann, thus they come. Brunner, largely forgotten. Niebuhr, forgotten. Tillich, and so on. You see, these names, Paul, Apollos, Cephas, And so they cling to men and they glory in men. This is a marvelous teaching, they say, and they run after this teaching and that. They're still doing it exactly as they did in the first century. You see, it's human teachers that matter. So we're always waiting for a new book, waiting for a new insight, waiting for some genius to appear who will speak the magical word. And he comes and he goes, and another comes, and we wait, and on we go. Oh, the difference when you come to this. There's no glory for men here. The glory is entirely God's. Do you notice how Paul ended that first chapter of his? Of him are ye in Christ Jesus, who of God is made unto us wisdom and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, that according as it is written, he that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. The glory, the credit, the honor is here entirely God's and not men's at all. Now there, you see, are some of the ways in which we see that the gospel is altogether and entirely different in its whole approach, in its very essence and genius, from all the teachings of men. So I go to my second principle, which is this one. Because all that is true, the gospel is consequently something that is beyond men's understanding. Now, I'm dealing here with the very essence of the modern position. Man doesn't realize that it's different. Then, you see, here is the second point, and this is a very vital one. But I lay it down as a proposition. Because the gospel is what it is, it follows of necessity that it is something beyond men's understanding entirely. Now then, here is a very crucial point. This is the reason why so many reject it. This is the great stumbling block. Man by nature is a philosopher. It's a part of his pride. He wants to understand everything. He says, I'm not going to believe a thing if I don't understand it. Incidentally, he believes a great deal without understanding it. I've often used the illustration of electricity. We still don't know what it is, but we use it, don't we? But man says, no, I'm not going to believe, I'm not going to allow it to do anything to me unless I can understand it. And this is the great stumbling block. Man can't understand this. And because he can't understand it, he rejects it. But it's a very vital point, because it determines, I say, our whole approach to the gospel. We come with our natural understandings, and we want to know, we want explanations, we want to understand. And here it is absolutely fatal. Now, let me demonstrate this. Why is it that men cannot understand this gospel? Well, the first answer I've already been giving to you. Because it is the result of God's mind, God's thinking, God's own understanding. That alone is a sufficient answer. This is the mind of the eternal, the everlasting God. And his way is a supernatural way. It is a miraculous way. Now, let's be clear about this. The gospel of Jesus Christ is frankly miraculous and supernatural. If it were not, it wouldn't save anybody. It is because it is supernatural and miraculous that it holds out any hope for us at all. Man, as I showed you last Sunday night, has completely failed. He cannot lay a foundation. God can. And God does it because he is God, and it's supernatural. It is miraculous. And therefore, by definition, it is something that eludes our understanding. Men cannot understand the miraculous and the supernatural. That is why he doesn't believe in it, because he can't understand it. But that's the height of his folly, because he can't even understand the natural. Look at the mysteries in science. Look at the mysteries even in what we have discovered. Well, then when you go into the realm of God himself acting directly, the whole thing becomes a sheer impossibility. So one reason why this gospel is altogether beyond human understanding is because of its supernatural character, because of the miraculous element, and it's full of that. It's full of angels. It speaks of things like the virgin birth. It speaks of the working of miracles. It speaks of the men rising from the dead. These are the very terms of this gospel. And all along, you see, they are miraculous and they are supernatural. This is God's thinking. But then, put to that, the state and the condition of man's mind. This mind of which we are all so proud. And there's no need for me to detract from that or to derogate from it. But look at it as it is. And the great characteristics you find are these. Man's mind at its best is very finite. It's very limited. How difficult it is to learn. Look at all the books. You can't read them. You haven't got the time. You can't understand them. Man's mind is finite. It's always coming up against limits and realms beyond which it can't go. Question marks, queries. Indeed, everything, as I say today, has become fluid and uncertain. But man's mind is not only finite. That's enough, you know. How can a finite mind comprehend the infinite? Can a man encompass the mind of God? Oh, read your Bibles and you'll see men who've tried in various ways to do that, admitting their utter inability, their utter defeat. But not only is man's mind finite, man's mind is sinful. And here is a much more serious thing. Our minds are biased against God, darkened. According to this teaching, our minds are not functioning as they should do and as they're meant to do and as they did in the original creation. Man's mind has fallen. His mind has become twisted. It's become perverted. We are full of prejudices. Now, when we're honest, of course, we know that and we admit that. Look at the political prejudices. People try to say that they vote at elections in terms of principles. I wonder. I've seen so many men, voting one way when they were young and poor, voting the exact opposite way when they get older and have made a bit of money. No, we're creatures of prejudices. And we've got our prejudices, racial prejudices, all these prejudices. Why, they're causing the chaos and the confusion in the world at the present time. You see, man's mind is not only finite, it's a diseased mind. It's a twisted, it's a perverted mind. So not only is it because of its smallness incapable of comprehending God and his ways, because it's dark and because it's ugly and because it's twisted and not straight, it cannot possibly do so. And thus the mind of the eternal is altogether different, as Isaiah puts it. My ways are not your ways, neither are your thoughts my thoughts, says the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways and your thoughts and my thoughts. Sinful, darkened, finite, incapable. That's another reason why we can't even try to understand it if we really have got sense. But there is another element here, and that's why I read that portion from the first chapter. The apostle teaches there that this is a part of man's punishment for his sin. Man's ultimate sin is pride of intellect, pride of understanding. This is the thing with which he defies God. So a part of his punishment is to be humbled in that respect, and the gospel humbles him. The wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. God hath made foolish the wisdom of this world. It is a part of man's very punishment. He can do what he likes. He can kick as he likes against it. It won't avail him anything. No, this is a part, I say, of man's punishment. He is made foolish. But lastly, this gospel is incomprehensible to men and his natural wisdom and ability. For this good reason, and this is something in which we all ought to glory. It is incomprehensible to men. It is not the result of men's understanding, because if it were, salvation would be the prerogative of only a few exceptional people. Do you see what I mean by that? If this gospel were something that men can understand, something that is patent to human understanding and comprehension, well then, you see, the result would inevitably be this. Those amongst us who happen to have been born with good brains, real ability, understanding, able to read, able to think, able to argue, able to be logical, able to follow the great demonstrations, why, they would have a tremendous advantage over the others, wouldn't they? And of course they're always in a minority. The vast majority of us have not got good brains nor much understanding, and we can't read these great books on philosophy and so on. Now, if the gospel were something that men can understand, and that a man is saved as the result of his understanding, it would be the prerogative of just a few. It would only hold out a hope for a mere handful of VIPs, as they're called today. But thank God it isn't that. If you are to have a gospel that can save anybody, it must not be dependent upon men's ability, but upon the power of God. And that is the truth about this gospel. Because nobody can understand it. The most ignorant and illiterate amongst us, and the one most lacking in brain power and intellectuality, stands as good a chance as anybody else. And that is where the clever gentlemen of the television don't begin to understand. Can you follow them? Can you understand what they're trying to say? Of course you can't. Thank God you can't. And it doesn't make any difference, because they don't either in an ultimate sense. No, I say thank God for a gospel which does not depend upon my understanding, but is the power of God unto salvation, the revelation that the Spirit of God can make to all and sundry, to any man. I have a gospel that gives the hope to the most illiterate sinner in London tonight. Thank God for it. No, it's altogether different. And it is entirely beyond human understanding. That brings me to my last big principle, which is this one. I want to show you now how in actual practice, with regard to the problems confronting us, this gospel does differ in every way from all men's ideas, or if you like, I'm going to show you how God, in his way of salvation, has made man's wisdom look utterly ridiculous and foolish. This is what we are told. The wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. God hath made foolish the wisdom of this world by the gospel. How does he do so? Well, you can see that by looking at the extraordinary contrast between the two things. And I say again that it is a complete contrast. I repeat that because if you don't grasp that, it's no use going on to consider details. Somewhere or another, if you don't grasp these fundamental principles, you'll be getting up at a certain point and saying, "No, I don't quite understand that. I say you mustn't. The foundation and the superstructure are all one. You mustn't bring in your philosophy at any point. The moment you do, you make it all of no value. It is altogether and entirely different. Let me show it you. Now, look for a moment at man's wisdom, by which we mean this. Man confronting the problem of the human race tonight, and man confronting his own personal problem. Now, this is what we all should be doing. All honor to the men who are trying to do this. But I want to show you the utter folly of trusting to men's wisdom with regard to this great problem. Why is our world as it is? Why is there so much unhappiness in life? Why is there personal failure? You know the questions. Now, look at man's wisdom facing this situation. These are the characteristics of men's wisdom. It always starts with men. Always starts with men. Starts with men and the human seed, and begins its investigations from that point. I think you'll all agree with that. That's always its starting point. Sociology, humanism, these are the terms. They give themselves away. They show that they think men alone matters. Man is the center of the universe. Everything revolves around men. So you start with men and you end with men. That is the great characteristic always of human wisdom. It must be, of necessity. If you know nothing beyond that, well, you're bound to start with that, and it always does. The second thing that characterizes it is that it always thinks that this problem is mainly an intellectual problem. Now, I could give you many examples and illustrations of what I'm saying. Are they not celebrating this year the centenary of the birth of the late Mr. H.G. Wells? Now, there is a typical representative of this worldly wisdom, this human wisdom, a man who ridiculed Christianity for the reasons I've been giving. Here he is, typical. And his books were very popular. kind of modern prophet, modern philosopher. And that was the essence of his teaching always, that the problems of mankind are intellectual, primarily, essentially, intellectual problems. He always said this. He said that what men needed, therefore, was education and so on. And that is why you remember the last book that he wrote, in a spirit of great dejection during the last war, bore this most significant title, Mind at the End of Its Tether. He couldn't understand why we'd had another world war. Why didn't man learn? The problem's an intellectual problem of education. So he used to be editor, you remember, of certain encyclopedias of science and of this and that, giving men knowledge and information. It was purely an intellectual problem. That is the essence of human wisdom. It was with the Greek philosophers. They sat down and thought about the problems. They drew up their utopias. They said, now, man needs to be instructed. This is what he needs. It's an intellectual problem. But then come to a practical matter. What is the view taken by worldly human wisdom of man himself? This is the crux of the problem. What is its view of man? What is its view of the nature of man? Well, you're familiar with this. I needn't keep you. It is that man is essentially an animal. They say a reasoning animal. Your cerebrum is developed a little bit more than that in the case of animals, but he's an animal with this developed cerebrum, so he's a reasoning animal. And he is developing. Now, but this is the crucial thing. You say, well, now, why does man behave as he does? Is he bad? Is he evil? Is he wrong? And the reply is, of course he's not. They say man is essentially good. You mustn't say man is bad. They say the Bible talks about sin, and it's an insult to human nature. It's the thing that's been the greatest drag upon the forward march and development of the human race. Mankind has been kept down by this notion, this doctrine of sin, that man is evil, that he's wrong, that you can't trust him. It's not true. Man is essentially good. He's noble. There are excellencies within him. He wants the best. The trouble is his environment. He doesn't get a chance. Man, they say, is essentially good. They reject and resent this doctrine of sin that you have in the Bible and in the message of Christianity, because their view of human nature is that it is essentially good. Well, then you ask, what is man's need? Well, they say this is quite clear. What man needs is a little bit of help. He's got that within him which is improving. He wants to get better. He's trying to get better. What man really needs, we are told, is to be improved. All he wants is more knowledge, more instruction, better examples. You see, they've sometimes put it like this, that what man needs is to get his mind and to rub that mind against the mind of these great thinkers and philosophers. If then man will improve, he'll begin to think properly. But man's fundamental need, we are told, is to be improved, to be educated, to be made better. Indeed, there is a process that's already doing it, but this needs to be helped, so we multiply our education and our cultural institutions, and thus we are going to improve man by a gradual process. And that lastly leads to this, you see, that confidence is being placed in man's ability to save himself. It is basic to man's wisdom with regard to the problems of men and the great problem of salvation. Man has got it in him to save himself, his society, and his world. He's got the mind, and it needs training and instruction, but he's got the willpower. Tell him what to do, and he'll rise up and do it. So you exhort him and you instruct him. You see, the essence of the position is this, in a sense, that man is regarded as a good being, full of love, but he hasn't had a chance. His environment is against him. You remember the emphasis that used to be placed upon poverty and slums as if they were the sole cause of sin, not realizing that those who lived in palaces and had more money than they could handle were guilty of exactly the same things. And by today, of course, we are being told that most of our problems are due to our affluence. Once upon a time it was men sinned because they were poor. Now we are told they sin because they've got too much money. You see, it's all a matter of environment. And therefore you must improve the environment. We're always being told this. And man is ready to respond. Give him a chance, and he'll save himself. This is the essence of man's wisdom, of humanism, call it what you will. It believes that man has it in himself, by his own effort and moral striving and diligence and application, to redeem himself, his own life, and that of society. There are the characteristics of human wisdom. What of God's wisdom? Can't you see that it's the exact opposite? Can't you see that it makes men's wisdom look utterly ridiculous and foolish? But my dear friends, even before I mention what this has got to say, doesn't contemporary history make men's wisdom look foolish? Why is the world as it is? If all that we've been told is true, why, it's not surprising that poor H.G. Wells died in dejection and with a feeling of hopelessness. He was almost in despair. What could he do? He wasn't the only one. There was another man who wrote his autobiography, the head of a college in Oxford, during the last war. The Jerseyman's Journal, I think he called it, Merritt, Professor Merritt of Oxford. He said exactly the same thing. He couldn't understand the last war. Professor Gilbert Murray, another great classical humanist, he said exactly the same thing. These men were really shaken and shattered by the Second World War. These were the men like Professor Gilbert Murray, were the greatest advocate of the League of Nations, and he believed that by going round and holding meetings and telling people they'd banish war, all a matter of intellect, you see, and application, and they couldn't understand. The wisdom of this world is made foolish, even by contemporary history. But when you look at the gospel, you see the folly of men's wisdom still more plainly and clearly. Look at the contrast. That starts with men. Where does this start? Well, as I've told you, it is with God. It is all from God. The Christian, as he looks at the modern world, he doesn't start with men, he starts with God. Why? Well, he says, where does the world come from? What is man? And he says you can't understand those questions except in the light of God. The Bible starts with the words, in the beginning God created. That's the way to begin. If you start with men, you'll always go wrong, because you cannot understand men except in the light of God. Secondly, this message says God's wisdom teaches us that the problem of men is not merely an intellectual problem. It's not merely a problem of knowledge. It is much deeper. It's at the very center of personality. According to the Bible, the trouble with us is not that we are wrong in this respect or in that respect. It is that we are all wrong. There is no health in him, says Isaiah. From the crown of his head to the soles of his feet, it is all rottenness. The Apostle Paul looks at himself and says, in me, that is to say, in my flesh as I am by nature, dwelleth no good thing. My friends, have you ever tested yourself in the light of these two teachings? Which is true of you? Are you a wonderful person? Are you good and kind and generous? Is it just that you've never been given a chance? That your environment is against you? That circumstances haven't given you an opportunity, or other people? Is it that? Or do you know that there's that within you which gets you down, that's rotten, that you're your own greatest enemy? I've often quoted it, I quote it again. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. It's the message of this book from beginning to end, that man's problem is a deep one, it's a profound one. It isn't merely intellect and understanding and teaching. It's something at the very center of man's being. He's become rotten in the core. And this is, of course, a part of its view of man, that he's a fallen creature, that he's evil, that he's perverted, that he's got a mind that is at enmity against God, that he is as he is because he loves darkness. Our Lord used these words. This, he says, is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, but men loved darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. That's the trouble with men. He loves the darkness. He delights in evil. He prefers the wrong to the right. Now, you see, the two views are diametrically opposed. Man essentially good, says human wisdom. Man essentially bad, says the other. Which is the better explanation of the state of the world today? Which is more adequate to deal with the present position? Why does man go on as he's going? Why doesn't he learn from history? Why does he repeat the mistakes of the past? There's only one explanation. He loves the darkness. He hates the light. That is the condemnation. Or as the Apostle Paul puts it in writing to Titus, he says, do you remember? There was once a time when all of us were hateful and hating one another. That, according to the apostle, is the condition of mankind by nature as the result of sin. Not nice, good creatures waiting for an opportunity to do good. Oh, no. Hateful creatures hating one another. And how true it is. Look at your modern society. How many of these politicians trust one another? I'm not talking now about the different parties. How many of them trust one another in the same party? Hateful and hating one another, selfish, self-centered. This is God's wisdom with regard to men. It's the exact opposite of the other. The whole basis is different. Indeed, it tells us that we're all guilty and under the wrath of God. What is man's need, therefore? Is it instruction? Is it enlightenment? Is it education? Is it to have a good example which you can imitate? Is that going to deal with this problem? Is the problem only in man's mind? No. We've seen it's deeper. It's in the very warp and woof of man's evil nature. And all the education and philosophy and culture leaves man as he was. Indeed, he seems to be getting worse. What's his need? And here is the eternal answer. He needs God. He's in trouble because he's estranged from God, because he's lost the face of God, because he's no longer under the blessing of God. Man's first need is to be reconciled to God, to have his whole outlook different, not to start with himself and end with himself. Start with God and continue with God. God the center, God the beginning and the end. To be reconciled unto God, to be forgiven, to be restored to communion and communication with God. What else does he need? And he needs it before even that can happen. Can't you see? Man doesn't need to be improved. Man's too vile and rotten to be improved. There's no point in painting a rotten apple or trying to polish it. No. Man cannot be improved. Man is in such a state and a condition that he must be born again. He needs an entirely new start. He needs a new nature. He needs a new heart. You see, these men, given insight by the Spirit of God, have always seen it. You remember poor King David, after he'd committed adultery and then murder on top of it. When he comes to himself as the result of the speech of the prophet to him, he writes the 51st Psalm, and he says, "Create within me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." He realizes that the trouble with him is not that he's done these things, but that he ever wanted to do them, that he's got a nature that desires such things. He says, I don't need to be improved. I need to be recreated. Create within me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. That's what man needs according to this wisdom. It's no use just teaching us. We've been taught. It's no use giving us examples. It's no use exhorting us. No. We need a new outlook. This is the condemnation, that the light is come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light. What do we need? We need a new nature that will love the light and hate the darkness. We need to be made new men and women. And this is the very thing that is offered to us, which brings me to the last point, which is this: the way of salvation. Here is a message that tells us that man is completely hopeless, that he is completely helpless. He's proving it. He's showing it in the modern world. We all know it in our own personal lives. How many a time have we made resolutions? How many times have we intended to be better, to give up some wrong or evil, always to fail? We can't do it. We are utter failures, every one of us. We've got a running sore in ourselves. Salvation is of God. Not the labours of my hands can fulfill thy law's demands. Could my zeal no respite know? Could my tears forever flow? Oh, for sin could not atone. Thou must save, and thou alone, and blessed be the name of God. That is what is done. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, says Paul to the Romans. Why not? His answer is, it is the power of God unto salvation, to every one that believeth, to the Jew first, but also to the Greek. He says, I'm ready to come and preach the gospel at Rome. I'm as ready to preach to the emperor as I am to the servants and the slaves. Why? Because he knows that emperors and slaves are all one. They're all failures. They're all perverted. They're all vile. They're all helpless. They're all hopeless. Nothing can improve any of them. Here is a power from God, the almighty power of God, that can give us forgiveness and pardon, that can give us a new nature. The God who created the cosmos at the beginning can recreate our souls and spirits and make new men and women of us and give us new and clean hearts. That's the message. You see, it's the opposite of everything man has ever thought. It's ridiculing man's wisdom. But you know, the supreme way in which this gospel shows the folly of men's wisdom is this, that men should ever reject such a gospel. That's the thing that exposes man's folly, that he doesn't recognize this. He doesn't recognize the Son of God when he stands before him. He can look at the cross and curse. He doesn't stand with Isaac Watts and say, love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. He doesn't see. He's blind. His wisdom is folly. What is he to do? Well, the apostle tells him, if any man willeth to be wise or seemeth to be wise in this world, what's he got to do? Let him become a fool. Let him say, I know nothing. Let him say, my knowledge and learning doesn't help me. It helps me in science, it helps me in industry, it helps me in politics, but when I come here to the matter of life and living, and life and death, and myself and my soul and God, I'm nothing, I'm nobody. I'm a great ignoramus, I don't know. Let him become a fool. Let him become such that the world will laugh at him and ridicule him as it did his Lord before him. Let him, in other words, in his helplessness and his emptiness and woe, confess his sin and failure to God, and in utter simplicity believe this glorious, wonderful message, that Jesus of Nazareth was the only begotten Son of God, that apparent man is God incarnate, that one dying on the cross is the author of life, the miraculous intervention of God, sending his only Son, living a perfect life, working miracles, showing his Godhead, conquering even death and the grave, able to give through the Holy Spirit something of his own glorious nature to those who believe in him. If any man willeth to be wise in this world, let him become a fool. Let him believe this gospel as a little child in simplicity, and he will begin to partake of the wisdom of God and be able to claim with the apostle in what he says at the end of the 2nd chapter, we have the mind of Christ. Let him become a fool, and he will be made wise with a wisdom transcending man's at its highest, the wisdom of God himself. Have you become a fool? Have you asked him to have pity upon you? Have you asked him to work the miracle upon you, the miracle of the new birth, the understanding of the things of God? Amen.
We do hope that you've been helped by the preaching of Dr. Martyn Lloyd-Jones. All of the sermons contained within the MLJ Trust audio library are now available for free download. You may share the sermons or broadcast them. However, because of international copyright, please be advised that we are asking first that these sermons never be offered for sale by a third party. And second, that these sermons will not be edited in any way for length or to use as audio clips. You can find our contact information on our website at mljtrust.org. That's mljtrust.org.